Our political commentators today at Sue Moroney and Ben Thomas. Kia ora korua.
Morena.
Morena, Catherine.
Morena, Sue.
Morena, Ben.
Thanks for being with us both. Sue's a former MP, Labour MP, now Chief Executive of Community Law Centres Aotearoa. Ben Thomas is a former National Government Press Secretary, a columnist and a Director of public affairs firm Capital. Right, bit about last week. Most of it, the headlines anyway, surrounding a minor party leader and really feeding into this narrative that the Prime Minister is struggling to register with the public. Still being upstaged by coalition partners, but also now 3 polls, I think, a trend, which have the left bloc ahead and also the PM's approval ratings poor. Can we just, talk about how serious this is and what the PM needs to think about to turn it around?
I think, first of all, you need to disclaim that Luxon has been in a uniquely difficult position for any MMP Prime Minister, maybe since Jenny Shipley was sort of trying to wheel together her sort of ship of the damned kind of coalition to see out the remainder of that late 90s term. But he's in a position where he has 2 genuine coalition partners who, even if they are not sort of outsizedly represented in Parliament compared to, say, New Zealand First parties in the past, ACT and New Zealand First have really kind of shaken off that psychological shackle that minor support parties have had in the past. And they've really recognised the mathematical reality that, if you pull out one of the Jenga blocks, the government goes. And, whether it was because Luxon, tried and failed to assert authority early on in those negotiations, but he has had 2 essentially deputies. I think of it as more sort of first amongst equals of 3 leaders, but he's had those 2 other leaders, Winston Peters and David Seymour, who are much more experienced than him, and are really unafraid to kind of act out and very much to differentiate themselves within the coalition, their parties, and to push back on exercises of the Prime Minister's authority. And that puts Luxon in a really hard position. Normally you get this sort of bump as, people say, well, I didn't used to think of him as the Prime Minister, but now it's much easier because he is. And, whereas Luxon has not had that clear air right from the first press conference.
You've got to make it for yourself, Ben, because not only have we got the hogging of headlines that's happening with ACT, I can't remember how many times it was leading the news last week, Seymour for one reason or another. Also sort of, putting out media statements that cut across something that the national minister's just put out, or says actually this was ours or whatever, or putting out a statement last week saying more funding cuts to come in the public sector. I think Erica Stanford had a go at him for something on TV. So he's good at getting the attention, but also dismissing the Prime Minister when he chastised him over the Polkinghorne letter and said it was inappropriate. He was pretty dismissive, publicly.
We've seen that before, with particular reference to, say, the Treaty Principles Bill, where Seymour sort of rebuked the Prime Minister about not kind of sticking to the good faith requirements of the coalition agreement. This is, this was a different case last week.
Right now, by the way. Here we are again talking about him.
Yeah,
but this is my point. These are experienced operators in your coalition agreement. You have to stamp your own mark on things, don't you?
And part of the issue has been that sometimes Luxon will simply vacate the area because he doesn't want to be involved in it. We saw that particularly with, whatever it was, the reserved seats for Māori and Pacifica students at Auckland University, where New Zealand First and ACT were going great guns on it. And also, even something like Waitangi, where Luxon and the sort of what I would call is, having worked for the Treaty Minister in the previous national government, the kind of sensible, centrist kind of consensus, bipartisan treaty position on the Crown Māori relationship. Luxon sort of goes down to Christchurch and kind of makes a speech about it, but all of the action is in Waitangi, with David Seymour pulling on one extreme and Te Pāti Māori pulling on another extreme, and the centre ground is just sort of ceded.
Coming to you in a moment, Sue, but the issue of this is now, with this latest round of polls, I think it's 3 that's got the theoretical left bloc ahead of the theoretical right bloc, but also those approval ratings looking pretty weak for Luxon. So, does everyone just carry on and say, look, he's a pretty inexperienced politician. He pulled together a national caucus that was in tatters. He's got his series of goals and he's pushing on. Or did they start to worry?
It is unprecedented.
That's for Ben, before I come to you, Sue. Did they start to worry, Ben? Sorry, Sue.
Well, look, I don't think that the barbecue talk was about replacing Luxon as the leader, but I think there was a lot of talk about his performance personally. And I think there's a recognition, not just in national, but across the government parties, that Luxon himself and his performance is a drag on their polling. We've seen the sort of, all in on economic growth as a way of sort of trying to divert that narrative. National, as the biggest party in the government, owns the economy as an issue, for better or so far for worse, because of the continuing sort of malaise that we've faced, and that the national government didn't cause, but that continues to drag down. There will certainly be concerns. There were other moves that, with the cabinet reshuffled to sort of shore up health politically. Dr. Reti obviously might feel hard done by with that, but they needed better political management of it. But then these other sort of movements, where you saw the sort of appointments and demotions in the select committees, which was quite an interesting thing when you start looking at caucus management of a national leader, because you had guys like Dan Bidwar, who I think has been an up-and-coming rising star for the last 7 years, demoted off from the chairing the Māori Affairs Select Committee. Stuart Smith, who might have thought that he was still in the frame for a sort of ministerial post at some point, taken off FEC and replaced by a newer MP. And also, who was the third one? Scott Simpson, who, whether he thought his ministerial days were behind him, you would sort of probably think he could do out the term as Environment Select Committee. So some interesting moves in terms of how he manages
the internal stuff,
should it ever come to a vote.
Righto, thank you. Go, Sue.
Well, look, I did want to make the point at the outset that this is unprecedented with the position of the current polls, that just a year after a new government had been voted into place, that the polls are showing that the voting public's starting to desert them already. And that's never happened before under MMP in a New Zealand environment. So it is a really unusual situation. And we've got the Prime Minister, Christopher Luxon, he's constantly in defence mode. And we've got Chris Hipkins, who's the opposition leader, the one looking relaxed and upbeat and being positive about the future.
He's not able to do very much, is he, at the moment?
Well,
keep the jandals on.
This is actually quite hard to do. It's, you have to work quite hard as the Prime Minister to not be the one who's upbeat and to be caught in this sort of situation where you're constantly in defence mode. So that's an issue for the National Party, and particularly around Christopher Luxon, because that's how he's always looking. And it's probably going to get worse for him because, all of the things that we've talked about are yet to play out. We'll talk about health later, but that's going to go from bad to worse. And so he's going to constantly be in defence mode. And he's trying to go out to the public and say, well, he's got a plan for growth, but all those things that he's talking about are so flimsy that they're just not getting any attention because they are so flimsy. Having more concerts at Eden Park, they've rolled out the tourism carpet yesterday. That's, all New Zealanders know that tourism is a great taonga for us, but that sort of high volume, low cost type approach that National has always taken over tourism is not the sort of thing that even the tourism sector itself has embraced. Prior to COVID, the tourist sector was actively looking at a strategy of actually going for high value but lower volume tourism as the way forward. So, all of these things that he's trying to get the public attention on and say, well, we really are about growth, they're just not substantial. They're very, very flimsy, and it looks like people can see through it. Certainly the media is not picking that up. What they are picking up instead is, David Seymour behaving like a naughty little boy. That naughty little boy is about to become the Deputy Prime Minister within a matter of weeks. the naughty little boy is going to be sitting beside Christopher Luxon in every single question time, in every frame that happens on the news or in social media. He's going to be sitting right there. He's come off the back of having the school lunches flop. We've got now evidence that backbench MPs in the National Party are so uncomfortable with ACT that they're criticising them, albeit by mistake, with a backbench MP sending a message to Carmel Sepuloni complaining about how they as backbench MPs are constantly having to defend ACT party policies when ACT's not really there to defend it themselves. So there's a deep sense of frustration that is brewing, not only with the public sense of how dysfunctional this is all starting to look, but also internally within the National Party itself. Right. And it's interesting that Ben was talking about the reshuffle because, it was a reshuffle that probably did more damage than did anything to present something new and exciting to the New Zealand public.
The point that you made about making an announcement is one thing, but the actual impact of it is something else. So let's come back to health, because we have the new minister as of, I think, 3 weeks ago. Majiapa announced her resignation 4 months ahead of time, I think just over a week ago. And then the Director General of Health announced her resignation just a couple of days ago. There's been another senior figure, I think, also moved from a comparatively senior role, but circumstances of that not quite as clear-cut. The question has been, who is now leading this vital, massive infrastructure and service, and does simply people moving on, does that do anything for solving problems or for the public's perception of solving problems?
Look, I think there was, Health NZ will go down as one of, hopefully, an incredible cautionary tale for governments that want to sort of dip their toe in reforming or want to make a big signal sort of symbolic, essentially an announcement, because that's all Health NZ was to begin with. The day that Health NZ came into being and district health boards ceased to be, there was no real change on the ground. All that happened was there was a new wiring diagram and nobody really knew where they fitted into it. The recruitment, I think, was done for a lot of symbolic reasons, which might have been, well intentioned because of the obvious issues that we've had with, say, Māori Health and Pacifica Health. But almost immediately, Rob Campbell, who was the chair, found himself offside over sort of LinkedIn comments and being a political pundit. And so this organisation has been in chaos from the beginning when it was started by, created by the previous government. I don't think anyone who's in there right now trying to sort it out, should be held to a sort of, 1 week turnaround time frame or a 3 week turnaround time frame. Right now they've got the commissioner in there, Dr. Lester Levy. It really is almost sort of like a kind of autopsy as much as it is an organisational restructure. Trying to figure out what is actually happening in there. And, it was taking months before we could even get sensible numbers coming out. Now, you can't turn it around in 3 weeks.
Well, the question is whether one person is going to turn it around. But with this departure, first of your minister, and then two of your most senior leaders, one in Te Whatuora, one in Health New Zealand, the other the Director General of Health, the chaos you refer to is now this government's problem, and people are going to tire of hearing about the mistakes of the previous government. So do you want to pick up? I mean, this was the subject of a parliamentary debate on Wednesday. Probably most members of the public have no idea that happened. But is it a signal of the fact that the headache for the incumbent government's about to get larger, not lesser?
Yeah, look, I believe so. You've got three senior leaders in the health sector who are highly respected within their various professions who have resigned within a week of each other. And they've resigned within a matter of weeks after the new minister has taken over. And I think that's hugely symbolic. It says to me that these three highly respected professionals are not prepared to be involved in the agenda that they have now heard of from the new minister. And I think they're actually deserting the ship to save their own reputations, because it looks to me like they will not be prepared to undertake that cost-cutting agenda. And I think that's what's behind all of this, that there's no walking away from the issue that when you deliver tax cuts of the magnitude that the National Party has delivered primarily to landlords, that you're not going to be able to keep putting the level of funding that's needed into health and education just to simply stay ahead of the game, particularly, when they've all been facing inflationary measures in the order of 5 to 7% themselves over recent years. So, it's not rocket science. If you go down that path, then there has going to be significant cost cutting that has to happen. And I think that this is what
there was a significant deficit, though, in Health New Zealand.
Health New Zealand has run $1 billion over its budget since it was created.
It still
Under
is
the
now.
previous government, it ran $1 billion over its first budget. The government had to bump up its baseline by $1 billion, plus then some pressures. And what happened? It went $1 billion over that. Health
So
is
that's going to be worsened now in the current situation, and the government has, by its own policies, worsened that picture. And I think these three leaders are jumping because they are not prepared, as Shane Retty, I don't think, was prepared either, to actually put that agenda in place. Simeon Brown is prepared to put that agenda into place, and I think the health sector is going to be in significant trouble.
Well, look, we're all speculating right now, aren't we, about why they departed. Here's some speculation, which is that, with that bureaucracy that was created with Health NZ, there was a lot of internal. It seemed like there was a lot of internal politicking going on as well. We had reports that there was a 17-step sign-off process for briefings that went to the health minister from Health NZ, including the chief executive signing off every piece of advice, apparently to make sure that they were all aligned or something like that. Now,
and then
more important is finding out what's actually happening in that.
So, what was that, Sue?
Christopher Luxon had to walk that back. It wasn't 17 steps at all.
No, this is not. This is not the earlier thing between
this
patients.
Is not the layers.
This is about the ministerial sign-off process.
This is just quite recent.
This is about a minister's office going to the Health NZ and saying, we need an answer to this. We need a briefing on this issue, and there being 17 sign-off steps.
So I take your point. It could be the new minister is also doing what the Prime Minister wanted him to do, which is to do the hard yards and push. That's another equally plausible theory. The question is, Ben, still, where does this leave the sorts of change that the public wants to see, and how long till it can be seen?
I think part of the dissatisfaction in the health sector is not really about Health NZ at all. It's, for instance, GP wait times is a huge one that I think the minister has, sort of talked about.
Well, the previous minister did, because he agreed with the Sapere report. The new minister came in and admitted he hadn't read it because he'd only been in the job for a week. So this is the thing with the change, Ben. Just changing the leadership and saying, I want this, doesn't necessarily make it happen.
Oh, absolutely, which is again, the entire problem with Health NZ to begin with. You can't just do a PwC or other big four, organisational chart, whack it into people's inboxes and say, now everything's better. Look, it is difficult. I think that the minister appeared to not express confidence in the commissioner last week. I think that strikes me as a mistake in the sense that
What's your last fig leaf, isn't it? Running the place. If I can put it that way. this is the person you put in to deal with the problem.
Yeah, that's right. What are you going to do? Get an observer for your commissioner? I think they need to have a bit of time. They do need to show some wins. Absolutely, that's why.
Sorry to interrupt you, but does this come back to some again of what the Prime Minister said were his strengths? I'm going to hold people to these standards. If they don't deliver, they'll move on. And is that looking a little bit more complicated, running something like a health system, perhaps, than running a company?
Well, I think that it's always been a mistake. I've seen it a lot over the course of my career, that people who have excelled in private business actually, when they come into a public service role, they really struggle because there's a whole different series of accountabilities and there's a whole different series of expectations. And if you get it wrong, it's not just about saying, well, the profits fall. If you get it wrong, it's actually about, ruining something as precious as our public health system, which is still world leading, can be better than what it is. But it's not like running Air New Zealand. It's not like being the chief executive who just mets out orders to people. There's a whole process within the health system of experts and what they know needs to happen in order to deliver good healthcare to the citizens of New Zealand. So it's not that simple. And I think the other thing I'd be worried about here is that let's not forget that Lester Levy replaced an entire board. He replaced an entire board, and now 3 key leaders have deserted the ship, and it is Lester Levy now been in the position that he loves to be in, where he's just running the whole show.
All right.
I certainly have never seen him deliver on anything that he has been involved in.
Well, he will say that he had 2 district health boards, I think, go into surplus after having been in deficit. I've heard others in the health system say that was time limited, that result.
Well, yes, and I also was the union organiser for one of those DHBs after Lester Levy had left, and it was in one hell of a mess and had to be retrieved.
In your opinion, right. Now, finally, the supermarkets. Again, this sort of comes back to what you were saying earlier, so making an announcement, but how much of an announcement is it? Ben, I know you've got to declare an interest here, but again, this time the Economic Growth Minister, Finance Minister Nicola Willis saying, we want more competition in the sector. That's not a new refrain. The question is, will you get it? She did seem to go a step further in almost inviting a third player to come and talk, right, about what they would need. But again, does that equate to a result, or is that possibly opening the door to a result?
Yeah, so just as a declaration, I've got clients in groceries and also in other sectors that the Finance Minister was talking about needing greater competition. Look, I think by and large, absolutely, we need more competition broadly in New Zealand, and in terms of, I think, the speech in particular, where she was sort of saying, come and talk to us, what do we need? Do we need to facilitate? It was really kind of continuing on that refrain from the Invest NZ announcement, sort of saying, well, look, if you're a player, if you want to come and invest in New Zealand, come and talk to us.
Tailor-made.
We'll open the doors. And look, we've got experience with this in New Zealand. We've always rolled out the red carpet for film, and presumably these other sectors won't be asking for $250 million rebates as well. But, you just look for opportunities where you can, tinker with any relevant regulations. If the Overseas Investment Act is an issue, it doesn't seem to have been an issue in the past, but if it has, look, what can we do for that? And I think that's a really positive move, whether it's in supermarkets, whether it's anywhere else. We have had this problem in New Zealand that if it is a sector that isn't well understood or isn't seen as as glamorous as a movie opening in Courtenay Place that the Prime Minister can go to, where, big players will come to the government and say, look, we really want to invest money. And they'll sort of basically just direct them to a website and the forms to fill out. And this doesn't happen everywhere else in the world.
What did you take it as, Sue? Was it Aldi, Costco, come and talk to us? Was it that direct?
Yeah, it did appear to be, but look, it's nothing new, and it's nothing that the previous government wasn't also interested in pursuing. But both governments want to treat this issue as if it will be fixed simply by competition, rather than actually also recognising that it's probably going to need regulation as well. They both have stepped gingerly away from that space. So, again, I would put it into the space of being a bit of window dressing, being quite flimsy, and nothing that's really going to substantially change the scenario that New Zealanders face of having, some of the highest food costs in the world, actually, for a food producing nation. I still think we've got to crack that nut. We're a food producing nation. How come our food costs are so out of control?
Thank you both. It's getting into the hard yards, that's for sure. It's getting interesting quite early this year. Thank you very much.